Well, thank you everybody for coming out here on the afternoon. My name is Bruce Patton. I'm the curator here at Savoy, and welcome to the fabulous Fiberglass Forum that we have for you today. Before we get into with Jeff and the guys here, what I'd like to do is just cover a few things. In a second. So hopefully our current exhibitions you guys got to see before you came in here. If not, please make sure you go back and take a look. But the one that's getting ready to end is A Quiet Greatness, so the Japanese collectible cars. That'll end next weekend. So if you haven't seen it, please make sure you go and see those. It's a great collection. We also have the American small cars with the Bantams and Crosleys, obviously the one we're here to talk about with the fabulous Fiberglass. And the locally owned cars, those include the two Batman cars in the front and then the ones going down the Great Hall. So, and also the Savoy collection cars. You can see what we have coming up here in 2025. You can also go to our website and look to see what the other exhibits that'll be coming up throughout the rest of the year. And we have our movies that are here in the theater once a month. The last one we did was Baby Driver. And what we have coming up next is The Transporter, so you can see that coming Friday, April 11th. I'd like to thank again Styles Auto Care for their sponsorship here that helps us put on these Tireside chats that we do. So I'd like to say thank you to them. And now then, I know you're not here to hear me talk. I'd like to introduce Jeff Hacker. Jeff from Undiscovered Classics here. So I got to meet Jeff and talk to him about doing this exhibit, and it was exciting. It's one we hadn't done before, and his wealth of knowledge on these cars is incredible. And so if you get a chance, go to his website there, the Undiscovered Classics, and it really gets into the real details, not only on these cars, but other cars that he has there. But Jeff graduated from the University of Florida. He actually has a PhD in industrial organizational psychology, so be careful. He'll be checking you guys out when you ask him questions. So, but again, I'd like to turn it over here to Jeff so he can introduce the guys and we can get started on the program. So, Jeff, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes. Is it working? Or is it just me? Well, it's great to be here, and thank you very much to Bruce Patton and the folks here at the Savoy. We've had a ball getting ready for this. A ball sending the cars here. Hopefully some of you had a chance to look at the cars. We've got 6 of the owners of the cars, 5 or 6, I think 6 today, that are with us. Some in the audience right now, some may be coming a little bit later. So our museum closes at what time today? 5 o'clock. So if you'd like to hear endless details about how cars are built, I assure you, nothing was built in 4 hours. If you saw it. Nothing at all. The typical car in the 50s, even with the audio, you saw something from the You Asked For It. You Asked For It was filmed in 1955. They were promoting sales of cars and show how easy they built. In reality, they took about 2,000 hours to build, even in the 50s. Now, 2,000 hours is 50 weeks of 40-hour weeks, and for almost for a full year. So it's a lot of work, and something that this probably took even more, and we'll talk about that in a bit. I'm honored to have 3 of my closest friends and some fantastic panelists and builders with us, and I'm going to read carefully so I catch everything here that they do, so bear with me. This is my writing, but I'm wearing my long-distance contacts here. Dennis Kazmarowski is on the far side here. Dennis has been a friend for about 20 years. We met 20 years ago. He's been building, restoring, and racing cars for over 50 years and has over 30 cars built to his credit. Mm-hmm. Most recently, he brought back to life one of the most specially hand-built cars of the 1950s, Strother McBin's Le Mans Coupe, which he debuted at the 2023 Pebble Beach, and we also took it to the 2024 Amelia Island last year. Yep. Beautiful, beautiful car. You'll see some pictures in our presentation. It's a black Corvette-looking piece. When you see something that looks like a 1969 or 70 Corvette, it's a 1958 Le Mans Coupe. It's way ahead of its time, and there's reasons for that. He'll speak to some of that later. Dennis's race history includes multiple regional and divisional titles in Trans Am, IMSA, and a run as a privateer in Le Mans in 1990. He also served as technical director of the Trans Am Racers for several years. His cars have appeared on the covers of major magazines with articles appearing in Road and Track, Porsche, Pan America, sorry, no, okay. Keeping Track of Vets, thank you. Sports Car International, and most recently a 14-page article in Magneto about the Le Mans Coupe. Yep. Dennis and his cars have won major awards and recognition at events including Amelia Island, Concord, Elegance, and Eyes on Design, which is in Detroit, Michigan. So Dennis, thank you for coming. Thank you for being
Thanks for having us, Joe. Thank you. Thank you.
I have known Steve Briscoe for 20 years, mine is 15 years, so what is that? 5 years, about 5 years or so. And Steve had a most beautiful car. It's the green car called the Novetta, if you've gone through. It's just an exquisite looking car that he actually put his own taste in terms of touch of the design and how it would look. Steve is a stand-up comedian, so if I'm vaguely funny, he's much better than me. Just listen to him. He's a martial artist and automobile enthusiast. He has owned dozens of collectible cars, lending his unique individual style to every one. Meaning, he takes a car, and unique isn't just interior or color for them, it's interior changes to the body, which is, if you'd ask any of the guys from the 50s and 60s, they're looking for sales on their cars. Take our body and do something with it. If you want to change it, you want to change its name, everything's game. Enjoy it, make it your own. That's what that was all about. Let's see, he's from a California look, 1958 Beetle with a rare Ocrasa. Sounds like, okay, Ocrasa modified motor. 65 Mustang with extensive high-performance modifications to a 1970 240Z, with which he prowled Mulholland Boulevard in the 1980s, California, no doubt. Okay. And now the Novetta, a one-off homage to the sports racers of the 1960s, built from the ground up with the express intention of striking that elusive equilibrium between form and function. Steve's ability to attract other highly talented individuals is a hallmark of myriad endeavors. In the case of the Novetta, the read also what Bruce Myers of the Peterson Museum said, you nailed it, which he really has. And it's an honor to have the car here. It'll be here for 4 months with the restorers. Hopefully, all are exhibit here for 4 months. And last and not least is Mike Puma. Mike known Mike for about 5 years as well, like Steve. Mike has joined me in also running Undiscovered Classics and saving the heritage, the history, and the cars themselves. He's a partner with myself. He's held a lifelong interest in collectible automobiles. His interest in vintage handicraft cars peaked with the acquisition of the oldest intact post-war electric car in America, 1959 Ladari Conquest by General Electric. I'm speaking fast, but what that means is most of the cars in the post-war electric history are small little shopping cars or small little golf carts. They're economy cars. What we're looking at more recently is how many large cars about this size were electric, battery-powered, because of all the interest in Tesla and electric cars and so forth. And Mike is leading that charge both by ownership and also in documentation. In his role side, along myself, what Mike helps me, helps to research, educate, and promote these unique cars, while also managing social media, including a growing YouTube channel. What are we up to now?
Over 10,000.
10,000 subscribers, which for a niche market for us is pretty big. It's any Camaro or Corvette or Corridor, they'd all beat us, but for a little guy, we're pretty big on the little guy stuff. Mike brings to the table skills beyond his passion for these cars as a co-owner of preservation works with property owners, developers, municipalities, pursuing historic preservation and tax credit rehabilitation programs. Did I get that right? Representing over $1 billion in reinvestment into historic buildings. So let me welcome Steve Briscoe as well as Mike Puma.
Thank you.
We're going to try to run for about 45 minutes. It's easily to kind of draw the line at any point, so I think that's not a problem. And then open up for about 15 minutes of questions. Is that right, Bruce? And we're going to start with the 1960s. Normally, for about 15 years, I've been working on cars of the 1950s, and we started a couple years ago really laying the basis to have more history, documentation, and showing. And the Savoy is the first museum to really help in that endeavor. And we've been planning this for like 3 to 5 years, and this is the first time we've had a chance to show cars ranging from the late 50s, like the 4. This is a VW-based one, and we've got cars to the mid-70s. I think the Manta Mirage that you brought, and a couple others in mid-70s, with an emphasis on the 1960s. So in this case, there was a shift from the 1950s. All the videos that you saw were from the 1950s. Beautiful. But the first question I want to talk about, did things change from each of your perspectives? And Dennis is a builder, and Stephen, we'll start with Dennis. You might need to, if you haven't, turn your mic on.
I'm on.
Oh, you're on?
You're
Okay,
on. Yeah.
good, good. So did things change? Was it the same process? Was it the same? What happened from the 50s to the 60s?
Jeff, I think the basics of the business was basically the same, but I think, so many people, I grew up in the 60s, and I built my first kit car when they were called that back in 1965, and I kind of hung around the Fiberfab company. And in those days, it was Fiberfab, and Devon was building cars right and left. They had their $295 body that they made close to 6,000 of them. And Devon D's and Devon C's. Devon D was a Volkswagen-powered car, and a Devon C was a Corvair-powered car. And, but the basis of the business stayed the same. However, they became a little bit more sophisticated. As you saw the pre-film on this in the 50s, you know, the kits came a little bit more complete. And when you moved from the 60s to the 70s, they became even more complete. And even in today, the business still exists, but today you're buying a body, a chassis, a car, in some cases already painted, and all you do is put your engine and transmission in it. And basically that's how you build a car. They're coming so complete today, it's just unbelievable. But consequently, the prices have changed as well. The cars that you bought in the 50s were $300-400 for a body. And then in the 60s, you were buying something in the $1,500 to $2,000. And in the 70s, it moved on to that. And the cars you buy today are $70,000 and $80,000.
As a kit, not
As a
complete.
kit, yeah. And but the industry still exists. You know, there are companies coming out there more and more as, you know, as they changed, as the government changed and put more regulations on these builders. They also changed. They made their kits more complete, made it easier for people to do, to stay up with things and be able to stay in business.
Okay. Appreciate it. What, Steve, from your perspective, you started with cars before your Nevada. Did you ever go back in the 50s, or was there something about the design in the 60s? Because the design definitely changed. Was there something that was more attractive
For me,
to
the 60s was sort of the touchstone for me, where I became really, really involved in cars. We went to the Trans Am races at Lime Rock, and it was Watkins Glen, and I saw the cars in the parking lots, Ferraris. The 275 GTB4 was one of the first cars I saw that I thought, this is like a dream. And if you look at the Novetta, it has somewhat of that perspective to it.
Mm-hmm.
But anything that touches your heart really deeply is what you're going to focus on. So for me, the cars of the 60s were the things that I really, really loved. The Ferraris and the Maseratis, the Lamborghinis, the European, reading Road and Track magazine and reading Peter Egan and following this guy here. So those sports cars are what I really, really loved. And the Can-Am as well. But they were out of reach, you know, in terms of a street car at the time. But that's what made it for me, was the 60 sports cars.
Okay. Mike, we put up there the Thor. One of our friends, I found the original Thors they built too, and one of them has been restored. It's the purple car, real cool purple car out there, very small, and it's VW based. Is that significant at all from the 60s versus the 50s? Mike focuses on history with me, and you've been canvassing that more.
Sure. Well, the Volkswagen platform was, I think, a game changer for the cars of the 60s, right?
Instrumental
Yeah.
in moving it forward. Yeah.
So if I remember correctly, the Thor, I think, was one of, if not the first American-based VW American Special. But prior to that, it was comparable to a lot of what hot rodding was, really, you know, Ford-based, Ford flathead powered, with some exceptions for Chevy small block power or other, you know, different platforms to utilize in it. But the VW, I think, really helped the 60s into the 70s iteration of these cars take off.
You know, Mike, as VW came in the 60s and 70s, in the 80s, you had the Fiero, and everybody was reskinning a Fiero. Either they were stretching the chassis, and they were putting Lamborghini bodies on them, and they were putting Ferrari Testarossa bodies on them, and so on. And that became the next Volkswagen, the Pontiac Fiero. And then as people got more and more involved in them, it was almost poo-pooing against the Volkswagen, and people were putting Porsche engines in them just to get away from the Volkswagen type of feeling. And even with the Fiero, you know, people went a little bit further in putting V8 engines in Fieros and so on. But the transition, the steps from Volkswagen to Fiero, it really has a tendency to really correlate between the two.
But along the way, whatever platform became popular, and therefore more people wanted to do them, the quality of the fiberglass, because they went into manufacturing it on a larger scale, the quality of the fiberglass became so much better. The original glass bars and the Devons, you could lift those things, they weighed 50 pounds. And then you get to something like this, and the fiberglass is really, really well done. And it was, you know, done in a proper plant and with proper, you know, measures towards quality. So I think the popular, whatever the format was, as long as it was able to be done on scale, it really increased the quality of the product you were getting to work with.
Steve, I think the manufacturers also, they didn't want their cars out there unfinished. They
Yeah.
wanted people to be able to take their cars to a show. And the more you let the average consumer do, the chances of it being finished are greater. The more the factory or more that the company that was selling the body could do themselves and hand it over to somebody, the greater opportunity was that car to actually make it to a show.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, when I bought the body of mine, I saw this sort of a germ of something that could be. And then to discover that the gull-wing doors were, you know, obviously a big highlight for, you know, automotive making. They never worked. They never worked on the 300 SL Mercedes gull-wing. And you know, I was nearly killed by one of those recently at a show. I turned and had the door open. It caught me in the temple and I thought, I'm out. But they were also tough to get into. And so I changed mine to something more conventional, you know. But, you know, that's also putting your own personal touch on things that I want to do. I've never bought a car that I didn't change the mirrors, change the steering wheel, change the wheels, do something. Drives my wife nuts. She goes, can you just leave it alone? You know, she also says, can I leave her alone? But, you know, that's 40 years of marriage.
So the 1950s, when I was doing the study originally on how you're building your car, you basically got a shell of a car. If you're lucky, you got doors. Usually just a line where you'd say, well, how do you make a door? And you get and some of these guys who helped me, I knew them, we've got a couple of them still around. So, well, you just get your saw and you start cutting the door, and that's what you do. But it's just the skin of a door. Well, how do you make the rest? Well, you use wood. And so we find these cars 50 and 60 and 70 years later, it's all rotted out. We've got better materials, composite we can use. It's way different than the 60s. It's, when we say better kit, what we're meaning is that some of them were really, really ready to go. In fact, by the 70s and 80s, I remember a car called the Aircon Boa. It was 82 or 86. Everything was done except the engine. And you chose Porsche VW and you did it yourself. That's the one extreme you're talking about. That.
Yeah, and Puma from Brazil.
Yeah.
Puma from Brazil.
Which is a VW-based car, too.
Yeah, but they actually, when they brought those cars over, they brought them over just a totally finished body, total interior. All you had to do is add your Volkswagen engine and gearbox to it. And literally, you know, when I bought an early stage Porsche Speedster,
Okay.
you know, body,
Yep.
you know, from wasn't Beck at the time.
CMC?
No, CMC was probably the worst one you could
Oh,
buy.
they were horrible.
So-
They were horrible.
But I bought one, and it was so boring to build. It was incredible. I mean, you read the instructions, and it said, put the green wire to the black wire, the blue wire to the red wire, so. And you get in, and the key's already in the ignition, and you turn it, and the damn thing starts, and you drive it down the street. And I thought, this is the most boring car I've ever built in my entire life. But that goes to show you how the whole thing progressed over the years. And today, you know, the word kit car is really not used that much. It's more of a component car because you're taking a component from here and a component from there. But it really has changed, and all for the better. All for the better.
So in the 50s, people like Noel Bangert, Viltrit, people who, if you're familiar with any of those names, for some of the big car companies that might have produced up to 100 bodies, I asked them for their instruction manuals. And I got a piece of paper, single-sided, not double-sided. Here's how you build your car. Did that change in the 60s? Did you just build it from scratch in the 60s, a car like the Jamaican, or a car? Did you get any, if you're going to build it from new?
No, you got
from your perspective?
You got instructions, you know, with it and so on. They weren't as detailed, and you know, you got pieces of paper that you would hold up, and they said drill a hole here and drill a hole here and drill a hole here.
You tape it to the body.
And it would never work, you know, it never. And I was always drilling a hole. You know, when you restore a car, you take a piece off, you look at it, you fix it if it has to be fixed, you paint it, and you put it back where it came from. When you build a car, everything you mount, you got to decide where this goes. And I can't begin to tell you how many times I've mounted something and I've stepped back and looked, or taken it down the street and said to myself, well, this just isn't working. And you have to take it off and fill all the holes in again and try to find another place for it. But, you know, and they had instructions, they weren't as detailed as some of them are today.
But they were definitely more detailed than the 50s. 'Cause
Oh,
I can-
yeah.
The
Back in the
50s
50s,
often-
you bought a shell.
Yeah, I
you
used to
know.
get a blueprint hand done by a car. You could see it, and we've got some of these on our website on Discover Classics, and they're wonderful. They're really a time when you were dreaming of, can I build this car? And the answer was, for most of them, probably 50% no. You can't build this car. It takes a special person with special skills, and usually a team of a few people to build a car, even in the 60s. If you do it yourself, even Dennis, who does the work, still has a team of people that he relies on specific pieces to do so they can do it in an expert way, even though he does the majority of himself. You can't do it all yourself. If you do, it's your lifelong project, at least in my opinion from what
Yeah,
we've
there's,
seen.
I don't think there's anything better than a list of good friends that
Oh.
you can go to.
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely.
when we were doing the Le Mans Coupe, you know, it was back to the 50s, Jeff.
Yeah.
You know, because all I had was a shell, you know, and we were, you know, as far as we came overall into the 2000s, we were right back in the 50s again, taking a body that had no doors cut out, no hood cut out, no wheel wells, and you had to decide yourself where everything and how it all worked. And with, you know, a list of good friends, it can be done.
Yeah, I had never wired a car before, and I had an electrical engineer wire my car, and he so overbuilt it. There were like 8 relays, and this thing has lights, a steering wheel, no windshield wipers, a horn, and a battery, and that's pretty much it, right? And he had all these relays and everything like this, and it never worked right. And a friend of mine who also teaches electrical engineering at a college says, whatever you do, don't pull that wiring out. Just troubleshoot it and find out where the problem is. Well, I don't like things done halfway, so I pulled it all out. I had a friend come over who happens to have worked in the Navy wiring F-14s. So I said, you know what, how hard can it be? Is there somebody smarter out there than me that can wire a car with like 8 elements to it? And we just laid it all out and slowly but surely went to each point and got a little, and you have to figure out where it's not going to run into something, where it's not going to get crunched, pinched, squeezed in the door. You have to figure all that out. We wired it all out. And he said to me, I remember this to this day, Peter goes, a very heavy Polish accent, he goes, well, this never happened. I go, what? He goes, everything worked first time. I'm like, all right, we did it right then, but we
Well,
took our time and
I don't, Steve, I don't wire my cars. If you want your windshield wipers to blink, I'm your guy. You know, believe me, I don't wire them. No, I take them to a friend of ours, and the guy is really good.
that's what they told
You
me.
know.
I was like, well, we'll give it a shot. I
Yeah,
gave it a
right,
shot, and I got lucked out.
So over the years, I've been researching not just the kits, but beyond that, the one-offs, a lot of one-off cars, and it's fascinating why someone would build a one-off car. Now, Mike and I added, it was a few years ago, but you had a chance to bring one of those one-off cars for a friend of ours, one that we had found and they got restored, the Canera. That's a one-of-one car. So how many cars have we found in the 60s? Do we still, that are unique designs that are one here, one there? Probably fewer, is my thought, than we found in the 50s. It was still an individual, I'm going to design a car, I'm going to build. I found far more unfinished cars than I have found finished cars. But I think maybe 5 or 10 unique designs so far that we found that were professionally, nicely done and so forth. But the one you want to talk about, the Canera, a little bit about Ray. Do you remember enough about how he built his car?
Yeah. So the Canera was built and designed in between 1965 and completed in 1966. And the research that we've done at Undiscovered Classics, along with the owner, Guy Durkin, basically positioned the car as the first true wedge car design. It was actually designed and built by Ray Canera, who later went on to have a prolific design career with GM, right?
Yeah.
Chrysler? One of the big 3.
Chrysler. No, yes, Chrysler.
Yeah, one of the big 3. And he was only 17 when he completed the car, and one of the best stories about it is that he actually drove cross-country with this open car, roadster, no hardtop, from Florida to California and back with his mom twice. And we actually have photos of it where there's this big, odd dumpster-looking thing attached to the back of it, which was containing all of their suitcases. But that's one of the few examples from the 60s, I think, that you could really say was done at an incredibly high level design-wise, even by somebody who was as young as 17. But to your point, most of them were coming out of larger production facilities like Fiberfab.
Right. In fact, what were the companies in the 1960s? from your, we've got a list, if we were going to share some with the audience, what were some of the biggest one was probably
Well,
Fiberglass.
you know, you had Devin that was pumping out bodies like crazy, and Bill Devin would be, we had an opportunity to meet Bill, and he would be the first to tell you that he should have just stayed with his 295-hour body because he was pumping them out like crazy. You know, and then you had Fiberfab, and then in the 60s, of course, you had the Doom Buggy craze that brought the fiberglass business to a whole nother level.
Yeah, Bruce
You
Meyer
know,
was the
Bruce
first.
Myers, and you know, you had everybody. I mean, every manufacturer actually had some kind of doom buggy. Even Fiberfab had their own. They had, it was called the Clodhopper, and yeah, that's what it was
And
called.
with a name like Clodhopper, you
Yeah.
know it's going to be good.
And but you know, they were all basic, and even Bruce Myers would have said to you, he made his biggest mistake by making it all just one body, because if there was anybody in this industry that was, there were so many copiers out there, people that would just buy a Bruce Myers body or
Take a splash off
and
it.
take a splash off and make their own, start their own company, make
Mm-hmm.
4 or 5 or whatever it would be. But in the early stages in the 50s, Jeff, I think the word fiberglass was all new, and the reason why you had companies popping up in the 50s is because this was new and exciting and supposed to be lighter and faster and this and that. And then in the 60s, the whole thing, I think, progressed a little bit more.
That's an excellent point. In the 50s, fiberglass was the carbon fiber of its day. I hear all my friends talking about over the years, carbon fiber, we want to see this Bugatti done in carbon fiber, or the hood components or different parts. And that's what it was for fiberglass, this new lightweight composite that was used in cars. It first came out in 1951 on cars. It was used in other things, in boats earlier and so forth. And people would travel to shows to see the fiberglass cars. Fiberglass has gotten the opposite, even though it's been in Corvettes, and plastic has been some of the production cars as well. But over the years, fiberglass has been, it's just a fiberglass car. Well, I don't know, when you see a car like this, it took a lot of effort, not just the design, but an incredible amount of effort to build too. And cars like Dennis, if you're getting a kit, again, it takes the same amount of effort. So fiberglass was the carbon fiber of its day. It was exciting to go to. People would go see the shows just for that. That flipped in the last probably 30 years or so. They saw, it's just a fiberglass car.
I think one of the main things I think people give fiberglass a bad rep for is because it was used to patch metal cars, and usually with poor results, right? So you have this transition from this miracle material in the 1950s that no one had ever seen before, and then it transformed into a number of different cars and other commercial uses, and then you had more people familiar with it in the 60s and 70s patching rotting quarter panels or trying to make a floor pan go from Swiss cheese to something that resembled flat. So I think that's probably in part why it had a bit of a bad reputation.
Yeah, but obviously, General Motors thought it was important.
Mm-hmm.
They came out with the fiberglass, the Corvette in '53, and that was pretty forward thinking for any major manufacturer to come out with something like that. And obviously, they proved it to be. Even Porsche, who fought it to the end, in 1964, when their 904, they came out with a fiberglass body. Didn't do it right because their fiberglass was fairly heavy, but it was their first shot at it.
Right.
And they actually fiberglassed the bodies to the frames, which also presented a problem because in between the fiberglass and the frame itself, the metal would sweat and it would rot out from the inside.
Yeah.
But they made a stab at it, and it's progressed today that the carbon fiber is. But carbon fiber, interestingly enough, has a shelf life. It does. Carbon fiber will become over the years fairly brittle, as where fiberglass will kind of stay, a little bit more flexible. So carbon fiber does have a shelf life to it.
I do want to take one of your points speaking about the Corvette, America's first fiberglass production sports car. It was the second to announce, right? The Kaiser Darren could have been America's first production fiberglass sports car. They announced first, but Corvette beat them to the punch, debuting in June of 1953. But one of the fast facts we like to cite at Undiscovered Classics is that even prior to your ability to buy a Corvette in the fall of 1953, there were no less than 50 other smaller fiberglass sports car bodies that could have been available to you, like the Woodall Wildfire or the Glasspar or Ladari. And Ladari is an interesting one that is dear and near to me because that was my first foray into this unique corner of the hobby. But Ladari, I think, was almost a predecessor of Fiberfab in some ways, in so much as that Fiberfab had so many offerings. But Ladari started with the Conquest, then they had smaller versions of it, and then their own unique designs. But then they continued to buy other companies. They bought Victress and rebranded some of the previous designs from the Victress company with different model names, and they lasted well into their early 60s. So they kind of spanned that mid-period, maybe a couple years after the start of it in the 50s, all the way kind of through the start of companies like Fiberfab, spanning both of those decades.
Yeah, it was, it's true that, Ladroy was one of the early companies. And, they did their thing, and, companies were buying other companies, and they were buying the molds. And even Bill Devin would tell you that when he sold his company, the Allied Fiberglass, never got paid for it, had to go back in, somewhere in Lincoln, Nebraska. I think he literally had to pick up his molds and move them back to California. So,
Was there one design that influenced, do you think, the 1960s? What did something dominate? There were three categories in the 60s. We had the dune buggies that you mentioned, and you had sports cars, and then to me there's what we call the Gazelle, kind of it's a Mercedes, the ones you've seen. For those
Neoclassical.
Neoclassic, right, the neoclassic design. But in looking at sports cars, because you have the dune buggy influences for dune buggies and neoclassic, but sports cars, was there one design that came out from Italy or America and such that everyone then took different versions of it?
They were. If you ever read the history of Fiberfab, I mean, it's hard to believe, Jeff, that a small company in California, maybe they weren't so small, but what they pumped out over a 4 or 5 year period in cars. You had the Jamaican, you had the Banshee, you had the Aztec, you had the Clodhopper dune buggy, you had an Avenger, you had a Valkyrie, which was the V8 mid-engine Avenger, and then you had the Centurion, which was the Centurion was just really forward-thinking from a sports car, even though it was a copy of. But these guys weren't taking molds off of existing things. These guys were doing the old way. They were making skeleton frames, bodies, and they were taking chicken wire, and they were taking plaster of Paris, and they were putting it on there and shaving it down. How they did all this in such a short amount of time is absolutely mind-boggling.
Well, from the start of things like, that's actually a good point about how things changed between the 50s and the 60s. Thinking of Glasspar at the forefront of it in 51, 52 to say your Fiero-based kits. As time went on, more design influences from existing cars made their way into them, which isn't to say they're not unique. Certainly, plenty of the cars from the 60s offerings are unique, but those in the 50s, while they did have some level of design inspiration, were almost predominantly their own thing. And then by the time you get into the 80s Fieros, you're literally just plopping down a replica of a Diablo or a Countach or something. And then the neoclassical cars, which in themselves are kind of a copy.
The MGs, the SSKs,
But the manufacturers, General Motors and Ford and Chrysler, back in the that time period, 55 to say 65, every year was a different car. I mean, it was amazing. I mean, you talk about changing. I mean, I grew up with it because my dad worked for General Motors, and he ended up as like an assistant plant manager at a General Motors plant. So when I was in 1957 and 58, my brother and I used to go down there and see the new cars coming off, but a massive effort to change over all the body panels and all this kind of stuff for the new car coming out. And if you look at 53 Chevy and a 54 Chevy, 55, 56, 57, 58, 59, 60, they were all different cars, totally different cars. Today, you have Mercedes that'll run the same body style for 15 years, 12 to 15 years.
I think there was a passion then for the design, a passion for innovation. I think even in the component car industry, there has been a subjugation of the creativity to the bean counters. You make more money off of putting out 50, 60, 100 Cobra bodies than you do trying to do something unique like the Factory 5 GTM, or is it the GTM? No, it's nice, but it's not a Cobra. Everybody knows a Cobra. Everybody knows a Cobra is cool, Shelby and all this stuff. So cars that are more recognizable. I mean, good Lord, you go to a car show, give me another Camaro, give me another 57 Chevy. Things that the the masses adore, it drives a lot of the industry now. Unique bodies. I mean, the Ultima obviously is a different breed of cat, but then again, they're also $100,000. So,
Well, I'm getting to the point, Steve, where even the supercars today all look the same.
all look
to me.
kind of the same.
They all look the
Yeah,
same.
yeah, yeah.
You know, there's very few that really look totally different.
Yeah.
You know, it's a matter of where you can put a wing, or where you can
Right.
change this, or where you can put
Right.
a light or something.
Right.
But
Yeah.
you know, you go to Factory 5, you go to their factory in Massachusetts, and they got stacks of Cobras.
Right, of Cobras, yeah. Yeah.
And they all have names on them. All those bodies
Are
have
sold,
names
yeah.
on them. They're sold. And I mean, it's still very much of a viable industry
Yeah.
today for a lot of these people.
Which I love, because people can go out there and build a car. Somebody that doesn't know how to do fiberglass, doesn't know how to style their own car, they can still say, you know what, I like this, I like that, and then they've got the pieces and they can put it together. So I love that that's still being done, but I do miss a little bit of the, you know, the Dennis Kazmarowski out there doing unique things. Chris Beebe doing like incredibly innovative, unique style.
Yeah,
You know?
I agree.
One point about the modern version of component cars versus even the 50s and 60s, well, and even now, they're so much more affordable to do. I mean, they're still quite labor intensive, but they're so much more accessible for somebody that's coming into the hobby.
Yep.
You can build an incredibly high level, high finish one of these cars for 25, 30 grand. You can't go and restore a 68 Dodge Charger that's a basket case without paying 15 grand for a shell that needs all new metal just to start.
That's right, Mike. I mean, there's so many people that are so upside down in their 64 Chevelle or their 66 Chevelle as compared to something like this. You know, we were talking earlier, and when you look at this, you know, as Steve's, I have a habit of changing everything, you know, and I look at this and I say to myself, why would I change a thing?
Yeah.
Why? You know, now Fiberfab themselves with the Jamaican added larger flares to it and so on, but that was more to accommodate different types of drivetrain.
Drivetrain, right, yeah.
You know, a little wider chassis that they were going to put it on, a Corvette or something like that. And but this is outstanding, just outstanding. I love it.
So in the 60s, the 300-pound gorilla company would have been what in terms of producing cars?
That would be Fiberglass.
Fiberfab,
And
without a
dominant.
doubt.
Yeah, and with
Yeah.
the designers, with
Yeah.
the production, and the art. You can see some of the brochures that I have up here today. With the other companies we mentioned, Mike mentioned Ladari, you mentioned Devon as well. I think we said Kellison too. And there were probably just a few others, but they really didn't start. It was all kind of, when I looked at it again for the presentation, I've always thought some of the cars here we have from the 70s were from the 60s. So the Monte Mirage is like 76. Sterlings were early 70s, the Monte was 1970. The changes, it kind of happened again. In the 50s, you had kind of a block of cars that was unique, and then that kind of slowly quieted down. And then the 60s was really dominated by Fiberfab, more than I ever realized until recently looking at all. In the 70s, you had more companies, like some of the ones that are on display. So the display here, the exhibit, is going to show you from late 50s all the way through the 70s, with an emphasis on the 60s, and then some unique cars as well. One of the cars that's in the exhibit is the Shark. Well, that's an outlier, if you've seen the Shark. That is not something you want to be driving around. The Shark was a car that I've had for 45 years. It was out from St. Petersburg, and it's basically like driving a prototype or a concept. It's basically like driving a chassis with decorative fiberglass. And I didn't drive it much, but it's a fun car to look at. It's one of the colorful looking, looks like a Shark kind of.
Yeah.
But Fiberfab would have been, what about the 70s? What were the big companies if you're looking at the 70s? Now Fiberfab,
Well, you know, you
off.
moved on. Fiberfab was still obviously
Viable,
still
very
in business,
viable.
but you also moved on to Manta cars. You know, they brought the Can-Am type of look. We have a Manta Mirage out there, and they brought the Can-Am look into a streetable type of car. And you have those, and then you have Marauder, a company called Marauder, which was out of Potomac, Illinois. And, you know, they did Lola T70s, and we have a Lola T70 out there on display, fabulous car. And, you know, these were, I mean, people were moving. I mean, if any one of us at our age would say to you, what was the greatest time of racing in the United States? And every one of us would say the early Trans Am and the Can-Am series. If you had to go further, you would say, okay, let's move into the IMSA GTP stuff. But those were the highlights of racing. And when you could take a Can-Am car or a Can-Am looking car and put it on the street, man, you really had something.
And those were composite bodies. When you started with I was greatly influenced by the Alfa Romeo TZ2. And they went from aluminum to a fiberglass body to save weight. And that started there. And then, of course, the Can-Am series with the Chaparral cars were all composite. They were composite tubs. Monocoques were composite. So to bring those to the street was the dream of every little boy.
I'll never forget on the cover of Road and Track. No, it wasn't Road and Track. It was Hot Rod Magazine. It was two guys out in California driving a Lola T70 Mark IIIB coupe on the street. Now, if you've ever taken an actual Mark IIIB coupe and took the engine cover off of it, it's all tire. I'm telling you, the tire's like, it's a 15-inch wheel. It's a 15-inch wheel this way and a 15-inch wheel this way.
Yeah.
And you look at it, and there's this little spot for a transmission, and it's a tire, transmission, tire. Yeah. And it's just outstanding.
Yeah,
just an outstanding look.
To see.
So looking at the audience here, and especially Bruce, curator here, Tim, why would anyone want to restore one of these cars? What would be interested in terms of taking one of these? You can find them today, unfinished cars, finished cars that you need brought back. Are these harder than a normal car? Are these easier than a normal car? Normal car being something we can get parts for on Hemmings and so forth. Because
but I think you want it's all about individualism.
Yeah.
It's all about wanting to have something different. It's all about there's two ways to look at this. You could start out with a virgin kit or a virgin body, like we did with the Le Mans Coupe, or you can buy something that someone started. Now there are two advantages. If you buy something that someone started, you end up correcting a lot of their mistakes, and you spend more time sometimes correcting their mistakes than you would if you built the car yourself. Or you could buy the virgin kit and just, so many people look at this and say, oh my God, I'm way over my head. And they already own the component. They already own the car. But it's really not that difficult if you segment it down, if you take the time and you look at it. Oh yeah, okay, that makes sense, or that makes sense, and you get it for. Then again, you ask your friends to help, and that's a big part of it.
It's the 90% of the joy of it is the time that I've spent with friends figuring stuff out. I've done enough fiberglass. I've done enough wiring. I've done enough engine work. I've done enough suspension work. But there are people out there who really know what they're doing, and they really want to share that information. I do a joke in my act when people say, if you were going to build another car, what would you do differently? I'd start with a car, instead of just a myriad pieces. But getting to know these people who know about suspension and suspension design. I mean, I read a book. That's how I figured out how to build this chassis. Is I built it out of 2x4s to fit the frame and hang a suspension on. And then I took it to a metal guy and had him build a tubular frame. But knowing that guy, meeting that guy, and watching him work, it was just an amazing experience. It's like watching, a Rembrandt paint a painting. When that guy was doing my roll cage, it was just...
But it also works in reverse. That guy that has that metal shop might need some fiberglass work done. Yeah. And he comes to me, or he'll come to you and say, can you do this for me? And that's how the whole thing works. I can't begin to tell you how many guys, I tack weld. I tack weld very well.
There you go.
But my welding's not the greatest.
Not the best.
But I have a friend of mine that I take it to him, and he finishes what I tacked, But when he calls and asks me to do something for him, hey Kaz, can you help me with this fiberglass piece here, or I need this door fixed here? I'm there, because these guys are truly invaluable.
And there's another element to it, and I took the Novetta to show a guy, a gentleman who once owned 3 of the original Cobra Daytona coupes. So this guy knows cars, and my buddy works with him. He says he's got to see this car, so I take the Novetta over there. And this guy comes running up to me. He's working on a $20 million, the Cobra, what is it called? The Lone Star.
Oh, yeah.
Okay,
yeah,
the Lone Star. One of one, built on a GT40 tub. It was designed by Carroll Shelby's people to make a street version of the GT40. And this guy owns it. He's a heir to the U-Haul fortune. He's got plenty of money to throw around. So this guy comes running over. He's working on the Lone Star. He comes running over and he goes, hey, I've been looking for you. I'm thinking, oh, who do I owe money to now that I forgot about? And he says, no, I do fiberglass work. And I go, oh, he says, I love your car. I love your car. Who does the fiberglass? I said, well, mostly me, and not well, so don't look too closely. And he says, no, what would you change if you could change anything? And he's like all excited. He said, what could you change? What would you do? I said, well, the only thing I would do now, at this point, I got everything the way I like it. The flares, the wheelbase, the nose, the doors I finished, I fixed. I would redesign the rear end. I would do a much more GTO, Ferrari GTO style, and I would do 904 Porsche. You know, I'm thinking, why am I telling this guy all this stuff? But it's all in my head, waiting to just, he goes, I want to do that. Mm-hmm. I want to do that for you. I said, I'm working on the Lone Star, and then I've got like a couple of weeks. I said, well, if he's doing the Lone Star, he built a panel, the little removable hood that you see on the GT40s have the split inlets for the air. He built one with the later style single inlet to get more air and a thing like that. I said, how much did you charge him for that? He goes, $5,000. I mean, it's literally a piece like this. I said, I can't have pieces. I'll work it out. And he gave me an unbelievable deal to do the dream back end on this car, and a trunk, so a usable trunk. It's just, and he just wanted to work on the car. Here was a guy that does McLarens and Lamborghinis, but they're production cars, and he does a million of them, and he does them all the time, and he helps these rich guys fix up their cars. But he wanted to work on something really unique, and he's been an incredible friend ever since.
Well, my draw to these cars isn't quite as fantastic as that story, but it's really twofold for me. I started getting bored with production cars in my early 30s. I'm 35 now, and production cars are great, but you've seen them all. How many more magazine issues can I read of Mopar Action where it's like, oh, this has got one of three because it's got a different color option for the seats.
And they're
it's getting boring.
They're cool,
so they're unique, and you can really make it your own. But I love the living history connection. I mean, we've got Chris Beebe here who designed this car. This is the first Jamaican. I've had the pleasure of meeting Merrill Powell, who was the co-founder of Victress, and I had a chance to talk to him. He's going to be 95, I think, next week or next month, and he was able to talk through with me one of the cars he designed on the things that I should consider changing or not changing. So as somebody who works in historic preservation, we're often using dead resources like newspapers and things. So to actually have the opportunity to talk to somebody through the design, it's just a unique opportunity and a unique space to work with real history. And compared to a production car, which, yes, you might be able to meet with the designer, but it's so unapproachable compared to these cars.
Right, yeah.
Well, the whole thing exists today. It's just at a different level.
Right.
It truly is. And if someone said to me, is this kind of waning or is it falling off? I would say no.
It's just metamorphosing.
There's less companies, doing it. But there are plenty of kits out there that you can buy that you can make them your own. These are available out there if you shop around. I know you just bought one.
Yeah.
And I've had a couple of these, and it's just, it's still a fun thing to do. Even I'm 78, and it's still a fun thing to do. And it's when you talked about guys coming over the house, and when we were doing the Le Mans Coupe. I invited 7 of my friends over, and each had their own little talent of what to do, and I said, can you help me with this? Well, 2 guys left right away. They didn't even stay for hamburgers and beer. They said no.
They knew what they were in for.
No way, no way. But the other ones, jumped right in, and it's been fun to that mention their names in magazines and major magazines, Magneto, and you know, being out at Pebble, and you know, they also take pride on the fact that they worked on a car that was on Jay Leno's show.
Yeah.
And by the way, Jay Leno's a kick if you ever get a chance to. You know, we went and just saw him recently on tour again after we were at his show, and his show's an hour and a half, and we literally laughed for an hour and a half. He's really quick and really a fun guy to be with.
I think I appreciate everyone's involvement here. We've got another 10 or 15 minutes for a Q&A. I think it's about that time. So if we have questions for the panelists or questions in general that we can answer.
Yep,
Bruce?
and as you guys may remember, if you will wait for me to get the microphone to you, because we are recording this, so would like to make sure we can hear the question.
You mentioned that carbon fiber tends to get brittle as it ages, whereas fiberglass doesn't so much. But then, so I'm curious, what is the benefit of carbon fiber over fiberglass since it's become more prominent? Is it just because it's lighter?
It's a different weave. It's done actually in a different way. I mean, carbon fiber today is, let me start out with fiberglass. Fiberglass is matte. It's done two different ways, woven or also a matte. And you take the resin, you put it in there, and you wait for it to harden and so on. And you get a fairly light panel, all right? With carbon fiber, they take the mat itself, which is carbon fiber, and then they suck the resin out of it, and they only leave as much as you could possibly have. And you get a super light panel that's very strong with not carrying all the weight of resin. That's the difference.
But by virtue of the fact there being less resin, it's more prone to elemental effects. So
Yeah.
it's going to dry out more, it's going to be affected by sun more, it's going to be affected by, you know, moisture and things like that. So. Anybody else?
Anybody have any questions?
So you mentioned earlier Bruce Myers, and so I have two parts to the question. Number one is that where the Manx came from?
Yes.
And I thought it was, but I see that that's now being reintroduced. Is that
Yeah,
from the
yeah,
same company? Is it descendants of Bruce's?
That's an interesting point, because you had Bruce Myers, the Manx, okay, and you had Bill Devon, the Devon, and those two companies are now re-existing themselves. Myers now is owned by a gentleman out in California, and they're actually coming out with, they have an electric Myers Manx that they're doing, you know, a full electric Myers Manx. And the dune buggy craze is starting to come back again. You know, I think maybe it's because all of us are starting to live back in our, you know, our youths and our back in, you know, when we had stuff like this. And we're reliving that time of our life. But the dune buggy business, there's companies out there. There's a company called Berrien out of Maryland that actually makes brand new dune buggy bodies, you know, and they're all in metal flake, you know, as they had back in the day. And I want to tell you, they're gorgeous. They really are very, very nice. And they do a very nice job. And so Manx is back in. And a gentleman, Kevin Callahan, just recently bought Devon bodies. And he owns the original molds, and he is pumping out brand new Devon bodies. And it's cool. It really is cool to see.
Jeff and I have tried to get Merrill to restart Victress, but you know, he said he's 95 now. He's not going to do it, but he'll probably live to 100, so we'll try again in 5 years.
He's got other hobbies he's into.
Yeah.
You know, when you have the display outside, you know, out there, you know, I think you have a great mix of what this industry was all about. You have the early cars that were done, and then you can see the progression of 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s.
Without going into extreme detail, for those people here that aren't familiar with the fiberglass process, could you describe basically from design, drawing, building the buck, what is a buck? How do you get a nice finish on fiberglass?
You know, back in the day, as I said, you know, it was it's hard to believe Fiber Fab pumped out the kind of stuff that they did, you know, in their short amount of time. You know, I think the company was in existence, let's use the frame of, say, 10 years. But when you had 8 different body styles that they had, and they sold 300 of these and 400 of those, that's a hell of a lot of cars. That's a hell of a lot of bodies, you know, over that period of time. And they did it the old-fashioned way. They would make a skeleton, you know. Interestingly enough, today, you can buy a skeleton. You can actually take and have a model.
A CAD cam.
And they could do it in a CAD cam. And in a crate will come a skeleton that you put together with all the ribs and so on and so forth. And if you want to make your own body out of that model, you know, you can do that. But it was plaster of Paris and wire, you know, and a whole bunch of, Jeff's got some pictures of people that were doing it back, and they're covered in white, you know, because they've been sanding and sanding and sanding. Then after a while, you know, you get it to the smooth, and then you take a mold off of that, and then you produce cars like this.
Yeah, so you do the skeleton, then you do the plaster of Paris and the chicken wire, and then you make a mold off of that, and you have to make the mold so that you can split the mold, pull it apart, and then you lay the fiberglass inside of that, and then you put the resin all over that, and then you wait till it hardens, then you pop it out of that, and then you smack it back together, and you trim the edges off, and voila, it's that easy.
But in today's world, you can you almost can do anything. You know, it's you know, when you see a large 10-foot tall, 15-foot long piece of styrofoam, and it's sitting on a table, and a 5-axis machine comes out and literally goes like this back and forth, and it changes, goes back in, changes a bit, and goes like this, and literally gives you the model that's sitting in front of you, the little model that you have in actual size. It's just, it's amazing what's being done today. But back in the day, back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, man, these guys were working real hard to put out these molds and these bodies and stuff like that.
Yeah, see, and I didn't have molds or anything like that. I started with basic fiber fab Banshee body, and I thought, there's just some things that need to be changed. So I would have to just either find fiberglass parts. A buddy had 65 Mustang flares, but I thought, well, the side of this body is kind of flat like a Mustang. Maybe those will fit on to this.
Mm-hmm.
So I put them up against it and drew a little chalk line and trimmed it and put some vet bond on there and glued them on, and those became my flares. And then I put the tire under there and trimmed it around to fit that. The front end I made out of, I made a little wire frame and then laid fiberglass over this little wire frame to make the front flares. There's a whole bunch of different ways to skin a cat, but
no, sometimes the old school way is still the best. It really is.
Yeah.
You know, it might be a little bit more difficult, but sometimes it's still the best way to do it. Yeah.
We have a couple of folks here who are participating.
We
in the
have
exhibit.
a question up here.
We have a question.
Yeah.
Is this on?
yeah.
Got
It's directed at Dennis, basically.
Can't hear.
In reading Dennis's bio, it talks of his racing past, his involvement with Can-Am series, endurance racing. And then you talk about the endurance racing of the 60s, getting into the GT races, late 60s, early 70s, Can-Am, GTP. My question is, I will say, it's a little bit loaded because I own the Lola outside, but the lineage going from GT40 to Lola to the Can-Am series to the GT40, GTP cars, all goes back to one person. And I'd like Dennis to let everybody know how he met that person in 1990 when he was trying to qualify for the 90 Le Mans.
Yeah,
it's an interesting story, and really you should hear.
We were at Le Mans, and this gentleman comes into our pit area, and he's very well dressed in a British sport coat, and he says, "You mind if I come in?" I said, "No, come on in." And we were trying to qualify. Mike, you were with us. The Lola 8810. It was a Corvette GTP. 8811. Yeah, Corvette GTP. And he comes in and he says, "I always loved this car. Always loved it." And I said, "Well, you know, that's great." I said, let me introduce myself. I said, "I'm Dennis Kazmarowski." And he says, "Oh, I'm Eric Broadley." The guy who designed the car was standing there, he said, and his design of Lola, and his company was Lola. And if a lot of the stuff Can-Am goes back to Lola. It really does.
Well, the original Lola GT
inspired,
sort of inspired the Ford GT.
And manufacturers went to a lot of the Can-Am guys when they wanted to have a car and to build it themselves. They actually ended up buying Lola chassis, maybe changing them, you know, and so on. But the base of their cars were Lolas. Yeah.
And the kart cars as well.
Jeff, I wanted to tell, if you could go to some of the Le Mans Coupe. Is that possible? We can get some of the pictures?
I don't have control. I don't know how much time we've got left either. Where's Bruce? Q&A, Bruce?
Oh, sorry, I had one more question up here.
Okay.
Oh,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Just real quick. In the about 88, 89, I worked for a company called Constellier, and they made a GTP car. It was a fiberglass body, and I was in high school, but they made the whole tub and the top portion. It was like a clamshell went together. I just wondered, I don't know what their output was production-wise, but is that considered still kind of a kit car, or was that kind of just a...
It was a component car.
It was.
Because you bought the drivetrain afterwards.
Yeah, but that was
you
the
guys know
Constellier.
Warren?
That was Mosler, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Mosler.
Warren, yeah.
Warren Mosler, and he actually designed a very nice-looking car after that.
Yeah.
You know, one that ran over in Europe quite a bit. I don't know. I can't remember the designation of it.
I think it was the Raptor, possibly.
Yeah, but you know, he was an interesting guy. They didn't make many of them. I think the Constelliers, they only made like 12. You know, 10 or 12. I think that's all they made.
Notoriously, the Constellier was considered the homeliest.
It was all Chrysler inside. I mean, they used a 2.2 liter turbocharged motor. It was more or less just a Chrysler drivetrain.
And just a homely car, and it went like stink.
But it was. They banned it.
It was outlawed.
Yeah, they banned it from racing because it was so good.
Because it was too fast.
Yeah, they ran like the 24-hour of Willow Springs and stuff like that.
Correct.
And after 2 years of that car just beating everybody, they told them to go away. You know, please don't bring it back. You know, one thing I wanted to tell you, if the Le Mans Coupe, when we had a chance to have the car at Leno's, on Jay Leno's garage, I'll tell you a funny story. Jay says, "Well, let's take it for a ride." Well, you know, the car had 7 miles on it, you know, and I said, "Sure." So he gets in, and he's sitting in the driver's side, and I get in, and I'm sitting on the passenger side. And there was a spring that held the door down, and if you didn't have the door, it was a gullwing door, and it was very light. So if air got under there, it would rip the door right off this car, you know. So I said to Jay, I said, "Please make sure you have the spring latched." Well, the spring fell off. I just didn't have it crimped enough. So it's on the floor of the car. And Jay's got his hands running around the floor of the car, and he says, he turns to me, he says, "I can't find it."
And it's not a big car. It's not a lot of room to...
So I'm sitting over in the passenger side, and I put my hand between Leno's legs. And I got my hand going around like this, and he looks at me with a straight face. He says, "Oh, the old drop the pen between the legs." Just like that. I mean, yeah. And we're driving down. You don't see it on the show, but we're driving down, and he's talking, and I guess I'm not answering him, and because the car only had 7 miles on it, and he says, "Kaz, are you listening to me?" I said, "Jay, I'm just trying to hear what's falling off." You know? Nothing fell off. It was a great day. The guy's got a tremendous collection.
Yeah.
You can go visit his collection, by the way, if you're ever out in California. There's certain days of the week you have to make arrangements. They have like a little tour. Sometimes he's there, sometimes he's not. But he's really a car guy and very, very much down to earth.
Yeah, he's
Very pleasant person.
Yeah, he used to go when I would work the Comedy Store. He would always show up, or the Comedy and Magic Club in Hermosa Beach. He'd always pull up in his Lamborghini Espada, and that was a highlight because he'd park it right out front. We're like, "Oh, Jay's here!" And that was fun. So, he's a cool guy.
I think the last thing, Bruce and I want to introduce just a few people who are here and who brought their cars for the exhibit, and hopefully they're getting them back. A few of them are worried, are we going to get our cars back? I said, I assure you, Bruce is the Savoy Museum will get them back. I think now, Carl, are you here?
Carl,
Carl,
up there
could you
in the
stand up
corner.
just for a second?
Carl, would you stand up?
Thank you.
There you
Carl
go.
has the Lola, 1970-something Lola that's out front of the Lola.
T70, Mark IIIB.
70 what?
Beautiful.
Yeah. We have Richard Brown here, who's got the 1958 Thor, the purple car.
Oh,
yeah.
And I think, for hold on for Chris, is there anyone I'm forgetting other than having Chris come up for a second? Okay, good. Chris, if you could stand up for a second. This is Chris Beebe. Chris Beebe designed this car back in the 1960s with his brother. And out of 150 or more, 200, how many do you think were made, bodies?
It's possible. We don't really know.
Okay, 150, 200, somewhere in there. This is the number one. This is the first one.
There's a club in Germany that has 85, I think.
Wow.
Wow.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah.
A lot of the cars, a lot of the component cars are really popular in other countries. It's interesting how it happens.
I don't know how we made this. I could describe it to you later
Yeah.
after this forum.
We're going to be doing an interview with Chris, depending if you live in audience or not, with this car in just a little bit, and we're going to go through some more of the specifics of it. Thank you very much on both our behalf. I'll turn it back to you, Bruce.
All right. Well, thank you again. I appreciate everybody, one coming out here on Saturday, and I appreciate the whole panel here actually coming here and getting to, experience the Savoy, but also, given their history, with the cars. We really appreciate you guys coming out and doing that. And thank you, everybody, for showing up. Hopefully we'll see you at the next program. So thanks so much.
Yeah. Thank you, guys.